The wind didn't just blow, it screamed. It tore through that forgotten mountain town like a blade, sharp and angry. Snow fell in a thick white curtain, erasing the world one cabin at a time. Through the blizzard, one lonely figure pushed forward. Her name was Martha Calhoun. And this town hated her guts. They didn't hate her for a crime she'd committed. They hated her for the space she took up in the world. They hated her for the way her shawls couldn't hide the soft roundness of her body. As she passed the saloon, the laughter hit her like a physical blow. "She ain't pretty, just fat." The words weren't whispered. They were spat into the air, loud enough for her to hear. She pulled her shawl tighter, clutching a basket of fresh-baked bread to her chest. Dignity was a fragile thing, and hers was about to shatter. She pushed open the saloon door. The warmth inside was thick with smoke, whiskey, and scorn. All eyes turned to her. The hinges didn't just groan, they shrieked, announcing the arrival of the one person nobody wanted to see. At the bar, Nellie Harrow, the innkeeper's daughter, was already smiling. It wasn't a kind smile. It was sharp and cruel, a weapon she wielded with expert precision. "Well, if it isn't our fine baker," Nellie sang out, her eyes raking over Martha's figure. "Brings enough bread to feed an army, and eats enough to be one." A wave of laughter rolled through the room, ugly and mean. Martha's hands turned white on the wicker handle of her basket, but her voice came out steady, even. "It will last the town longer than words, Miss Harrow." She placed the loaves on the counter. "Best you store it right." The comeback only made them laugh harder. From a corner, Deputy Amos Rohr, a man whose authority came from his badge and not his character, lifted his glass in a mock toast. "Fatty widow speaks the truth," he bellowed, a crooked grin splitting his face. "Maybe she should be sheriff. She's already got the belt for it." The insult landed, hot and shameful, right in Martha's chest. She refused to let them see her flinch. She just kept her eyes on the bread. The crusts were perfect, golden brown. The smell was rich and warm. The bread was good. She knew that much. But then she felt a stare from across the room. It was different from the others. It wasn't filled with mockery or pity. It was heavy, unblinking. It came from a man named Jonas McGraw. He was a mountain of a man, sitting alone in a dark corner. The town whispered he was more beast than human, a hermit who preferred the company of bears to people. He hadn't said a word since the first snows drove him down from his cabin. But now he was watching her, just watching, as if he saw something no one else did. Sheriff Wardle Pike, a man worn down by age and apathy, finally sighed from his spot by the stove. "All right, that's enough. Leave the woman be." Nellie just tossed her long braid. "It's only fun, Sheriff. She knows that." But Martha didn't know that. It wasn't fun. It was a slow death by 1,000 cuts, and she'd been bleeding for years. She gave a small, defeated nod and turned to leave, pushing her way back into the storm. The wind howled in her ears, but it was quieter than the laughter she left behind. The road home was a white nightmare. Every step was a battle. Her basket was lighter now, but her heart felt like it was filled with stones. She thought of her husband, gone 2 winters now. He'd never called her pretty, but he'd eaten her food like it was a prayer. Maybe that was love, or maybe it was just hunger. Suddenly her boot snagged on a hidden root. The world tilted. The basket flew from her hands. Her precious loaves of bread, the only proof of her worth, tumbled into the deep, wet snow. The steam rising from them vanished in an instant, like a dying breath. A gasp tore from her throat. She fell to her knees, frantically trying to brush the snow off the crusts, her hands already numb with cold. Her shawl fell away. Her hair whipped wildly in the wind. She was alone, kneeling in the dark, her work ruined, her dignity gone. And then another pair of hands appeared in front of her. They were huge, calloused, and surprisingly gentle. They picked up a loaf of bread and carefully, methodically, brushed away every last snowflake. She looked up, her breath catching in her throat. It was him, Jonas McGraw. He was crouched in the snow beside her, his face unreadable in the faint lantern light. He didn't speak. He didn't smile. He just held out the clean loaf of bread as if it were a treasure. His silence wasn't empty. It was full. It held no judgment, no pity. It held respect. It was more than she'd felt from anyone in years. Tears pricked her eyes, but it wasn't from the cold. A single desperate whisper escaped her lips. "I can cook, sir," she said, the words both a plea and a promise. "Even if they don't think much of me." Jonas held her gaze for a long moment. Then he gave a single, slow nod. It was a nod that said he understood everything. He placed the loaf back in her basket, rose to his full, imposing height, and walked back toward the saloon without another word. He left her there in the blizzard, but for the first time, she didn't feel entirely alone. She made it back to her small, leaning cabin at the edge of town. The fire was low, the room was cold, but the smell of boiled potatoes offered a small comfort. She sat by the hearth, stirring a thin stew, the echoes of the saloon still ringing in her ears. Nellie's smirk, Amos's sneer. But louder than all of it was the memory of Jonas's silence. The weight of his gaze. The simple, profound act of saving her bread. The wind rattled the windows, trying to get in. Martha closed her eyes. She didn't cry. Tears were a waste of salt, and salt was for preserving meat. She just sat there, breathing in the smell of onions, feeling a tiny, unfamiliar spark ignite in the cold, hollow space inside her chest. But as the night deepened, a new sound cut through the howl of the storm. It was the crunch of boots in the snow. Slow, measured, deliberate. And they were getting closer. The winter got worse. It wasn't just a storm anymore. It was a siege. The snow buried fences, collapsed roofs, and locked the mountain pass. The last supply wagon was just a frozen lump somewhere on the trail. The town was cut off, and the town was starving. Hunger didn't make people kinder, it made them meaner. Their jokes got sharper, their eyes got colder, and all of that coldness was aimed at one person, Martha Calhoun. The whispers followed her everywhere. She eats more than she bakes. Her body is proof of her greed. They saw her not as a fellow human being in peril, but as a liability. A mouth that took more than its share. But still, she baked. She scraped together the last of her flour, ground dried peas into a gritty paste, and rendered every last bit of fat she could find. She made it stretch. She made it work. One night, the mood in the saloon was grim. The men were hollow-cheeked, their bravado gone, replaced by the gnawing fear of empty bellies. Nellie Harrow's voice, usually dripping with scorn, now cracked with panic. "We'll starve if we let her manage the cooking," she announced, pointing a trembling finger at Martha, who stood silently in the corner. "She'll eat half of it herself before it ever reaches our plates." Every eye in the room turned on Martha. The accusation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but what was the point? They'd already decided who she was. And then, the floorboards groaned. Jonas McGraw stood up. He didn't just stand. He rose, like a mountain coming to life. The entire room fell silent. For days he had been a shadow in the corner, but now he was the center of everything. His voice rolled through the saloon, low and powerful, like thunder in a canyon. "If she cooks," he said, his eyes locking onto Nellie, "I'll stand guard." He swept his gaze across the room, meeting every man's eye. "If you doubt her, you doubt me." The silence was absolute. You could have heard a snowflake land. Deputy Amos Rohr started to chuckle, but the sound died in his throat when Jonas's dark eyes settled on him. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs. She couldn't look at him. She couldn't let him see the hope and terror swirling inside her. This silent, mysterious man had just drawn a line in the snow, and he was standing on her side of it. The sheriff, looking deeply uncomfortable, cleared his throat. We'll put it to a trial then, he stammered. Let her cook for the town with what's left. We'll see if she's wasteful. The unspoken part of his sentence hung in the air. And if she is, we'll deal with her. Martha gave a single sharp nod. It was an impossible task. Feeding an entire town on scraps and dust was a fool's errand. But the shame of their accusations was worse than the fear of failure. She would not let them starve her of her dignity, even if her body followed. She left the saloon, the weight of their suspicion following her out into the storm. Her cabin became a crucible that night. She worked with a feverish intensity, her mind focused on one thing: survival. She ground peas and bark into a rough flour. She boiled old bones for hours until a thin, watery broth emerged. She hacked frozen roots from the iron-hard ground and shaved them into the pot. Her back screamed, her arms ached, and her hands were cracked and bleeding from kneading the dense, stubborn dough. But as she worked, something shifted inside her. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of her body as a curse. She felt it as a source of power. This was work that would have broken a smaller, frailer person. But her body endured. Her strength was real. It was hers. By dawn, the smell of baking bread and simmering stew filled the frigid air. A line of hungry, skeptical townspeople had already formed outside her door. Their faces were pinched with hunger and distrust. One by one, she placed a steaming loaf into their outstretched hands. She ladled the thin, but hot, stew into their tin cups. They ate. And a strange thing happened. The smirks vanished. The narrowed eyes softened. A murmur went through the crowd, a low hum of astonishment. The food wasn't delicious, but it was hot. It was real. And it was enough. Hunger had stripped them of their cruelty, and her simple food had reminded them of their shared humanity. Even Nellie Harrow, after a moment's hesitation, ate her portion, her pride swallowed along with the stew. Amos licked his fingers clean, a sheepish look on his face. Old Jeremiah Boone, a man who'd seen more winters than anyone, pointed the stem of his pipe at the crowd. She fed your bellies when your swagger and your pretty words couldn't, he rasped. You remember that next time your tongues get to wagging. For a little while it seemed like they would. The town softened. The men tipped their hats when she passed. The children smiled. The whispers died down. It wasn't kindness, not really. It was a grudging respect born from full bellies. But a full belly can make a man bold again. And whiskey can make him stupid. That evening, Deputy Amos Rohr, his courage restored by a bottle, staggered out into the street. He saw Martha crossing the square, her basket empty, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. He blocked her path, his grin returning, uglier than ever. The fatty widow thinks she's a savior now, he slurred, his voice carrying through the quiet street. Feeds us scraps and thinks she's a queen. A few of his cronies, drunk and foolish, laughed along with him. The fragile peace shattered. The shame came rushing back, cold and overwhelming. Martha froze, clutching her empty basket. She wanted to run, to disappear, to let the snow just swallow her whole. But before she could move, the laughter choked off. A shadow detached itself from the darkness. It moved with a terrifying speed and purpose. It was Jonas McGraw. He didn't say a word. He grabbed Amos by the collar of his coat and lifted him straight off the ground. The deputy, a big man himself, dangled in the air, his boots kicking uselessly, his face a mask of shock and fear. Jonas's voice wasn't a rumble this time. It was a crack of thunder that shook the entire town. Say another word against her, he snarled, his voice raw with a fury that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. And you answer to me. She is worth more than all of you put together. He leaned in close, his next words an oath sealed in the frozen air. By my life, she'll never stand alone again. He dropped Amos into a snowdrift like a sack of garbage. The silence that followed was heavier and colder than any blizzard. The wind itself seemed to hold its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. They just stared, their drunken courage evaporating into the night. Jonas turned his back on the pathetic deputy and stood beside Martha. He didn't touch her. He didn't look at her. He just stood there, a silent, unmovable wall between her and the town. Martha's knees felt like they were about to buckle. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. Never stand alone again. The words echoed in the sudden vast silence of her mind. For a lifetime of insults, a lifetime of loneliness, no one had ever said anything like that to her. She looked up at him, and in the space between them, in the falling snow, something new and fragile and fiercely alive was born. But as she stood there, basking in the warmth of his protection, a chilling thought crept into her mind. The town's supplies were almost gone. Her miracle meal had used up nearly everything. They had maybe a day or two left at most. Then she remembered something. A detail that didn't make sense. Sheriff Pike had been in charge of the town's storeroom. He was the one who'd told them how little they had left. But Martha had been in that storeroom just last week. And she remembered seeing a lot more than he'd let on. There had been sacks of flour hidden in the back, barrels of salted pork tucked under a tarp, enough to last them another month. So where did it all go? The fear that gripped the town was different now. It wasn't just fear of the storm or of starvation. It was fear of Jonas McGraw. His oath hung over the settlement like a gathering thundercloud. The men who had laughed at Martha now avoided her gaze. The women who had whispered about her now fell silent when she entered a room. It wasn't respect, it was terror. And Martha hated it. She continued her work, stretching their meager rations with a skill that bordered on magic. Every morning, she served the thin stew and the hard bread, and every morning, Jonas stood watch, his hand never far from the axe on his belt. He was her guardian, her champion, and her jailer. His protection had built a new kind of wall around her, one made of silence and intimidation. She knew she should be grateful, but all she felt was a different kind of trap. She'd traded the cage of their scorn for the cage of his fury. One evening, she found him chopping wood by his cabin, the rhythmic thud of his axe echoing in the frozen twilight. The cold didn't seem to touch him. He worked without a coat, the muscles in his back and shoulders coiling and releasing with each powerful swing. She set a bowl of stew on a nearby stump. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. He stopped, the axe resting on his shoulder. "Do what?" "Scare them," she said. "I don't want them to fear me." He turned to face her, his eyes dark and intense. "Better they fear you than mock you. Fear keeps you safe." "I was never safe when they mocked me," she countered, her voice gaining strength. "But I'm not safe now either. This isn't living, Jonas. It's just waiting." He stared at her for a long moment, then his gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "You're right," he said, his voice a low rumble. "This isn't the answer." He looked past her, toward the town hall, where a single lantern glowed in the sheriff's window. "And something else is wrong here." Martha's heart skipped a beat. "The food," she whispered. "There should have been more." Jonas nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing. "Pike took inventory. He holds the key to the storeroom. He's the one who told us we were on our last legs." The implication hung between them, cold and sharp as an icicle. The sheriff. The one man they were supposed to trust. Could he be the one starving them? It seemed impossible. But the alternative, that the food had simply vanished, was even more so. "The storeroom has 2 locks," Jonas said, thinking aloud. "Pike has one key, the blacksmith has the other. It takes both to open it. Pike wouldn't risk getting caught." But the food is gone, Martha insisted. I saw it with my own eyes. Sacks of it. Jonas looked at the axe in his hand, then back at her. A plan began to form in his eyes. There's another way into the storeroom, he said. A floor hatch in the back, leads to an old cellar. No one's used it in years. It's probably boarded up. Or maybe, Martha said, a cold dread creeping up her spine. It's not. Later that night, under the cover of a moonless sky, they moved through the silent streets like ghosts. The wind had died down, and the silence was unnerving. Every crunch of their boots in the snow sounded like a gunshot. They reached the back of the town hall. Jonas worked quickly and silently, prying at the frozen boards covering the cellar hatch. The wood groaned in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the dead of night. Finally, with a sharp crack, the hatch came loose. Jonas lit a small lantern, casting flickering shadows against the wall. He lowered himself into the darkness, then reached up for Martha. His hands were warm and strong as he helped her down. The cellar was cold and smelled of damp earth and rot. But there was another smell, too. The rich, unmistakable scent of smoked meat and grain. Jonas raised the lantern. Its light fell upon a hidden cache. Sacks of flour piled high, barrels of salted pork and dried beans, wheels of cheese. It was all there, everything that was missing. Enough food to see the town through the rest of the winter and then some. They had been lied to. They were being starved deliberately. But then Martha saw something else. In the corner of the cellar, partially hidden behind a stack of barrels, was a small, crudely made cot, and on it lay a worn leather satchel. She recognized it immediately. It didn't belong to Sheriff Pike. It belonged to her late husband. The breath left her body in a painful rush. What was his satchel doing here? He'd been dead for 2 years. This cellar was supposed to have been sealed long before that. It made no sense. Jonas saw the look on her face. He moved toward the cot, his expression grim. He picked up the satchel and opened it. Inside, nestled amongst some old papers, was a small, tarnished silver locket. He handed it to her. Her hands were trembling so badly she could barely open it. When she did, a small, faded portrait looked back at her. It was a picture of her husband. But he wasn't alone. His arm was around another woman, a woman with a familiar cruel smile and a long, dark braid. It was Nellie Harrow. The world tilted on its axis. Nellie and her husband? It was impossible. He had been a simple, quiet man. Nellie was the town's bitter princess. How? When? Jonas was looking at the papers from the satchel. His face was a mask of stone. These are deeds, he said, his voice flat. Deeds to half the properties in this town. Signed over to Nellie Harrow. The signatures are forged. Badly. He looked up at Martha, his eyes filled with a terrible understanding. He wasn't just cheating on you, Martha. He was helping her steal from this town. They were planning to run away together. The betrayal was a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Her husband, the man she had mourned, the man whose memory she had clung to, had been a thief, a liar, in league with the very woman who had made her life a living hell. But that wasn't the worst of it. Jonas was still looking at the last document. This one is different, he said, his voice barely a whisper. It's a life insurance policy, taken out on your husband. The beneficiary is Sheriff Wardell Pike. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Her husband and Nellie were robbing the town blind. But they must have gotten greedy. Maybe they tried to cut the sheriff out. Or maybe Pike saw an opportunity. He was the one who found her husband's body after the hunting accident. He was the one who had declared it a tragedy. But it wasn't an accident. It was murder. And the sheriff was the one who pulled the trigger. He killed her husband, took the insurance money, and then used the hidden stash of food, the food her husband had helped steal, to control the town. He was going to let them starve just enough to be grateful when he miraculously found the supplies, cementing his power for good. Nellie, without her partner in crime, was left with nothing but her bitterness. Martha felt a cold, hard rage crystallize in her heart. They had taken everything from her. Her husband had stolen her trust. Nellie had stolen her dignity. And Sheriff Pike had stolen her future. They thought she was just the fatty widow, a weak, pathetic creature they could mock and manipulate. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. "He has to pay," Martha said, her voice low and dangerous. The woman who had flinched at whispers was gone. The woman who had cried over spilled bread was gone. In her place was someone new. Someone forged in betrayal and grief and hardened by a righteous fire. Jonas looked at her, and for the first time, he saw not just strength, but a warrior. He nodded. "They all will." They left the cellar, the satchel, and its terrible secrets in their hands. The plan was simple, and it was deadly. They wouldn't just expose Pike. They would use his own greed to destroy him. The next morning, the town gathered for their daily ration. The mood was desperate. People were weak, their faces etched with fear. Sheriff Pike stood before them, a picture of solemn authority. "My friends," he began, his voice full of fake sympathy. "The situation is dire. We have barely enough food for one more day." He let the words hang in the air, letting the panic build. Right on cue, Nellie Harrow's shrill voice cut through the crowd. "It's her fault!" she shrieked, pointing at Martha. "The widow! She's been hoarding food! I know it! Search her cabin!" A murmur of agreement rippled through the hungry crowd. They were desperate enough to believe anything. Amos Rohr stepped forward, a smug look on his face, ready to lead the charge. This was Pike's plan. Frame Martha, the town outcast, become the hero who uncovered her greed and then found the missing supplies. It was perfect. But then, another voice spoke, clear and cold. "There's no need to search her cabin," Martha said, stepping forward. The crowd parted before her. She wasn't cowering. She was walking tall, her eyes locked on the sheriff. "Because the food isn't there." She stopped directly in front of Pike. "It's in the cellar under this very building, isn't it, Sheriff?" Pike's face went pale. A flicker of panic crossed his eyes before he masked it with outrage. "What is this nonsense? The woman's gone mad with hunger." "Am I?" Martha asked, her voice ringing with newfound power. She held up the leather satchel. "Then maybe you can explain what my dead husband's belongings were doing down there with it." She opened the satchel and pulled out the forged deeds. "Or perhaps you can explain these. Documents signed by people who can't even write their own names, giving their land to Nellie Harrow." Nellie gasped, her face turning as white as the snow. The townspeople began to murmur, looking from the papers to Nellie to the sheriff. The seed of doubt had been planted. "This is a lie!" Pike roared. "A desperate fabrication!" "Is it?" Jonas McGraw's voice boomed as he stepped out of the crowd to stand beside Martha. He was holding the final piece of evidence, the life insurance policy. "Then explain this, Pike," Jonas said, his eyes burning with cold fury. "An insurance policy on a dead man, with you as the beneficiary. Funny how a man has a hunting accident right after you insure his life." The crowd gasped. The pieces were all there. The stolen food, the forged deeds, the affair, the murder. It was a conspiracy so vile, so evil it was almost unbelievable. But the proof was right in front of them. Pike was trapped. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, for an ally. But he found none. The faces that had looked to him for leadership were now filled with contempt and rage. Amos Rohr, seeing how the tide had turned, quietly backed away into the crowd, pretending he'd never been involved. Nellie started to sob, a pathetic, broken sound. "He made me do it," she cried, pointing a shaking finger at the sheriff. "It was all his idea. But it was too late. The town had seen the truth. Old Jeremiah Boone spat on the ground at the sheriff's feet. "We trusted you," he rasped, his voice thick with disgust. "And you left us to starve." Pike, his authority shattered, made one last desperate move. He drew his pistol. "Stay back, all of you!" But he wasn't facing a weak and starving crowd anymore. He was facing a mob united by betrayal, and he was facing Jonas McGraw. Before Pike could even aim, Jonas moved. He was impossibly fast. He crossed the space between them in 2 long strides, grabbing the sheriff's wrist and twisting. The gun flew through the air, landing uselessly in a snowdrift. Jonas slammed Pike against the wall of the town hall, his forearm pressed against the sheriff's throat. "It's over," Jonas growled, his voice a low promise of violence. The townspeople surged forward, their hunger replaced by a burning need for justice. They didn't need a trial. They had all the proof they needed. They dragged the sputtering sheriff and the weeping Nellie to the edge of town. They weren't murderers. They wouldn't hang them. But they wouldn't show them mercy either. They were banished, cast out into the storm with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their fate was left to the mountains and the winter, the same fate they had tried to inflict on everyone else. As the 2 figures disappeared into the swirling snow, a silence fell over the town. It was over. The lies were broken. The truth was out. They turned, as one, to look at Martha. She wasn't the town outcast anymore. She wasn't the fatty widow. She was the woman who had saved them. The woman who had faced down a murderer and won. Martha looked at the faces around her. She saw shame. She saw regret. But for the first time, she also saw respect. Real respect, not the kind born of fear, but the kind born of admiration. She walked to the storeroom and threw the doors open. "There is food," she announced, her voice clear and strong. "Enough for everyone. Today, we feast." A cheer went up, a raw, joyous sound that seemed to shake the very mountains. That night, the saloon was transformed. The air was filled not with smoke and scorn, but with the smell of roasting meat and baking bread. The sounds were not of cruel laughter, but of music and celebration. The entire town was there, sharing a meal, their community reborn from the ashes of betrayal. Martha was at the center of it all, not as a servant, but as a leader. She directed the cooking, ensuring every person had their fill, her face glowing in the warm light of the fire. Later, she stepped outside for a breath of crisp, cold air. The storm had finally broken. The sky was clear, filled with a billion glittering stars. Jonas came to stand beside her. For a long time, they just stood in comfortable silence, watching the stars. "My husband," Martha said finally, her voice soft. "He saved your life once, didn't he?" Jonas looked down at her, his expression unreadable. "How did you know?" "I don't know," she admitted. "A feeling. The way you said you'd never let me stand alone. It wasn't just a promise. It was an oath you'd already taken." He nodded slowly. "Years ago. A blizzard, much like this one. I was trapped in a rock slide. He found me, dug me out with his bare hands. He saved me, but the effort, it weakened his heart. The doctors warned him. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd look out for you. So that was it. The source of his silent vigil. A debt. A promise to a dead man. You've paid that debt, Jonas," she said, turning to face him. "You don't owe me anything." "I know," he said, and his voice was different, softer. "This isn't about debt anymore." He reached out and gently took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwined with hers. It wasn't a gesture of protection or duty. It was a gesture of simple, profound connection. "Martha Calhoun," he said, speaking her name like it was something precious. "You are the strongest person I've ever known, and you are beautiful." The word hung in the air between them. Beautiful. A word no one had ever used for her. a word she had never dared to use for herself. But hearing it from him, in his low, sincere voice, it felt true. A tear slid down her cheek, but this time it wasn't a tear of shame or sorrow. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated joy. The town thrived. Under Martha's guidance, they rationed the food fairly, worked together to clear the pass, and rebuilt the trust that had been shattered. Her kitchen became the heart of the town, a place of warmth and community. And Jonas never left her side. The weight she had always carried was no longer a burden. It was her strength, and she had finally found someone strong enough to help her carry it. The winter eventually gave way to spring. The snow melted, revealing a town that was scarred, but not broken. It was a new town. A better town. A town that had learned the hard way that a person's worth isn't measured by their size, but by the size of their heart. And at the heart of it all was the widow, who had found her voice, her strength, and her home, all because one man had been willing to see past the surface and recognize the truth that had been there all along. If you enjoyed this story of justice and redemption, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss another tale.